Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be comparing the brand new Panasonic G9 to the Panasonic GH5. So both of these cameras have the same 20 megapixel micro four thirds sensor, but the Panasonic G9 is targeted at still shooters and the GH5 is targeted at videographers first and foremost. Take a look, if you would, at this table I put together. This has all the main functionality and hardware differences between the GH5 and the G9. Hopefully this will help make this decision easy for you. In this video I'm just going to go through these line by line and give some insight and thoughts on them. So let's get started. So first let's look at price. The GH5 is $300 more expensive than the G9. These are both launch prices. You can get the GH5 for closer to $1,700 on eBay, but that's going to be gray market. Size. Now this is a little bit more tricky because if you go by dimensions alone, they're pretty similar, but if you look at real world pictures of these two cameras side by side, you can see that the G9, yes, it has a big bulky grip, but the actual body itself is quite a bit more trim than the GH5, and the camera weighs a decent amount less as well. So I think in hand, this camera is not going to feel as big and bulky as the GH5, even if the specifications and dimensions would lead you to believe that that's the case. Now, of course, the big advantage of the GH5 would be the video specification. This camera has many more frame rate options, variable frame rate, 422, 10-bit, all internal, much higher bit rate codecs than the G9. The G9, though, I'll just say this as somebody who shoots the G85, I'm using the G85 now. The stock codecs provided by it, the 100 megabits per second in 4K and the 28 megabits per second in 1080p, they're pretty good clean codecs. So I don't really have a problem with the G9 personally offering these specifications. The big headline is the G9 does get both 4K 60 and 1080p 180 frames per second slow-mo from the GH5. So even though you're not getting the codecs, you're not getting vlog like you get on the GH5, you're still getting some pretty powerful video creation tools, and man, that 4K 60 is going to be really nice to have. Something else you're getting with the GH5 is unlimited recording time on all modes. On the G9, I believe there's a 10-minute limit for 4K 60 frames per second and a 30-minute limit for 4K 30 frames per second. And that second one really has me scratching my head because the G85 I'm shooting this on has no limit in 4K whatsoever. Right now it's telling me I have an hour and 20 minutes left on this card. It's not going to stop it after 30 minutes. So I think that might be a tax issue rather than a hardware limit, at least for 4K 30. Because yeah, the lower spec G85 can handle unlimited recording at 4K 30, but this new G9 has a 30-minute limit. Thumbs down, Panasonic, on that one. Now, another headline feature where the G9 excels over the GH5 is continuous shooting speed. Now, let me just say, if you're talking about strictly mechanical shutter, these two cameras have the same specification, 9 frames per second with continuous autofocus and 12 frames per second with single autofocus with autofocus locked. But the G9 offers an electronic shutter option where it will shoot up to 60 frames per second with locked autofocus and up to 20 frames per second with continuous autofocus using that electronic shutter. The GH5 does not give you those options at all. So of course the big question out there is how good is it for doing that for 20 and 60? Is the rolling shutter, does it allow that, or are you going to get these jello effects? From what we've seen on the readout speed on the GH5 and also the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II, I think it's going to be pretty competitive. I don't think rolling shutter is going to be too bad. So I think in most cases that 20 and 60 frames per second advantage of the G9 for the electronic shutter will be quite usable. Now, another really nice usability benefit of the G9 over the GH5 is that beautiful electronic viewfinder. The resolution and the 120 Hz refresh rate, that's the same. Those are common to both the GH5 and the G9, but the G9 pulls ahead by offering an amazing 0.83 times magnification on that EVF, making it the largest viewfinder of any digital camera, any SLR that you can buy today. In fact, it is so large on the G9 that Panasonic has actually offered 2 magnification reduction options to 0.77 times and 0.7 times if you're an eyeglass user and you can't get your eye close enough to that viewfinder to be able to see the whole image. You can shrink it down. The GH5 is 0.76 times by default. That's the only setting. Now, another massive benefit depending on your usage of the G9 over the GH5 is the brand new stabilization module. This is probably the same module that Olympus uses on their OMD EM1 Mark II because it allows the same 6.5 stop of image stabilization. We're talking like handheld 4, 5, 6 second shots depending on the focal length. Like, this is huge. You can leave your little tripod at home if you're going out in the city and getting tail lights streaking by, or kind of longer exposure shots. You can just handhold those with 6.5 stops of stabilization. That is huge. On the G85, I'm able to handhold down to 2 seconds. So with this G9, that takes it even further. And the GH5, just the same as the G85, has 5 stops, which is good, but 6.5 is great, and that's a benefit that can be realized in stills as well as video. Now, possibly because of that brand new module and that brand new mechanism, the G9 is able to do a 8-shot stacked high-resolution sensor shift algorithm that allows it to output an 80 megapixel RAW or JPEG image. The GH5 and all other Panasonic cameras cannot do this. So for certain static situations you have to use a tripod. It would be pretty awesome to have that option to do 80 megapixel stills. Another hardware advantage of the G9 over the GH5 is the ability of it to charge over USB as well as run over USB. So using a battery pack, you can have basically as long battery life from the G9 as you want if you plug in. The GH5 unfortunately cannot charge or operate over USB. Something else I noticed when I was examining the USB ports, the G9 uses a micro B USB plug. You can see it's kind of a split bifurcated plug, and the GH5 uses the more modern USB-C style plug. The speed on both is still USB 3, but that's just an interesting difference I saw. And another thing is, and this is really nitpicking, but if you look at this, the GH5 has a little hinge for those doors. It actually has a little stainless steel rod, and the doors open and close on that. Whereas the G9 just has kind of a cheaper flexible plastic plug retainer thing. The ports just kind of flop open and hang by that. I've never had one of those doors break on me, but it's just a little cost-cutting thing that I would have preferred if they used the hinge doors from the GH5 instead of the flappy doors like the G85. Unfortunately, another area where we're seeing cost cutting is on the rear LCD. The GH5 uses a really nice 3.2-inch 1.62 million dot RGB W display, and that W means there's a white pixel for each triplet of RGB. The camera can use that to brighten the display outdoors or to save power by driving white instead of combining RGB to produce white. So it's a higher spec panel, it's a slightly larger panel. The LCD on the G85 is the exact same 3-inch 1.04 million dot RGB LCD from the G85. So that's one thing that kind of sucks. You're spending all that money to upgrade from the G85 or whatever, and you're getting the exact same LCD. Now, moving to the front of the camera, instead of a little Leica logo on the bottom right, you're getting this mode switch, and by default, if you switch this to 2, it actually completely silences the camera. It uses the electronic shutter, turns all the beeps off, but you can program it to do whatever you want. It's just a really quick 1-2 function swap that's on the G9 but not on the GH5. Something else you'll notice looking at the front is the G9 offers a second function button to the left of the lens mount, whereas the GH5 just has one. Looking at the top of the camera, of course, you'll see a top LCD on the G9 that's not on the GH5. The camera mode dial and the drive mode dial on the GH5 have been combined into a tiered dial on the G9 and moved over to where the drive mode dial is on the GH5, and then a large status LCD was placed on the top where the camera mode dial was on the GH5. So that's really nice for still shooters. Maybe you're coming from a DSLR and you're used to having that status display. It's just something to help bridge the gap. It's also good for power conservation. You can just turn off that back LCD if you're just using it for status. Use that top LCD, which uses a fraction of the power. Now, the last difference I have listed on the table is the fact that the GH5 is a global camera, meaning there's only one GH5. It's for all markets worldwide, whereas the G9 is sold as both an NTSC and a PAL camera. So if I have an NTSC camera, my choices would be 24p, 30p, or 60p. If I had a PAL camera, it would be 25p, 30p, and 50p. So yeah, thanks for watching. This table just kind of highlights all the things I noticed that were different between the two cameras. There's probably going to be more stuff coming out next couple of days as more people get their hands on this. But for me personally, it's a pretty easy decision to go with the G9. The improved IBIS being a big thing, the bigger EVF being another, slightly smaller size and weight, lower price, pretty easy for me. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I'll catch you later.